Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Kuf Aleph. Today on Yom Haatzmaut, our learning is dedicated in celebration of 78 years of Israel's independence. And today's daf is sponsored by the Hadron Zoomers and the entire Hadron family in honor of Becky Goldstein. Becky, we are in awe of your strength. Seeing you join us on Zoom for the daf from the hospital is an inspiration and true expression of Hagita Bo Yomam Balayla. May the merit of your learning bring you a refuah shlema, hoping to see you back in full strength soon. Okay, we were going to get started with our daf. Okay, before we do that, one more thing. I just want to remind everybody to register for the Siyum. Okay, we have a great program, kind of overview of Masechet Menachot from Alana Stein-Hain, and also learning one of our learners from Hannah Hassan. Okay, we are going to get started. We have a bit of a complicated daf, so I'll warn you in advance. But so be very focused as you can to get the flow on what's going on. We started with a Mishna, and I'll try to keep bringing you back. We started with a Mishna of Menachot and Nisachim that become impure. We distinguish in this Mishna between Kedushat Dam and Kedushat Aguf, things who have inherent sanctity, that's Kedushat Aguf, which can't be redeemed unless it's an animal that has a blemish. Then we talked about things that were really, first we talked about Kedushat Dam, where only their value is sanctified, in which case, what's the main difference the Mishnah talks about? Can you redeem them or not? So again, you can only redeem Kedushat Haguf if it's an animal with a blemish, nothing else. Anything else can't be redeemed, even if it's impure. Whereas, if Menachot or Nisachim, which just before they became sanctified, Kedushat Haguf, before they were in the vessel or something like that, they can be redeemed if they're impure. Came Shmuel and said, even if they're not impure, they can be redeemed. Because anything without inherent sanctity could be redeemed no matter what. That's the big topic of today, okay? Although we have one more thing to do before we get there. Now, basically Shmuel then, after he said, even if they're Torim Niftim, so you have to explain why did it say Nitmu? Well, it said Nitmu in the beginning, if they're impure, they can be redeemed, to say that at the end of the Mishnah, when they're Kedushat Aguf, inherent sanctity, they can't be redeemed even if they're impure. That's why we wanted to tell you. Why is that a chidush? Well, we ended with saying because a Baal Mum is called Tameh. Maybe a Tameh is like a Baal Mum, and since a Baal Mum can be redeemed, even if it has inherent sanctity, maybe a Tameh can be redeemed even if it has inherent sanctity. No. Mishnah wants to tell you not. So we used the language of Tameh in the beginning to get to the language of Tameh at the end, and then we said, why did we even need that? Well, we needed that because you might have thought it's like a Baal Mum. Now we have to just explain where's a Baal Mum called Tameh. Okay, and for this, there's actually an interesting section in Vayikra. I'm not sure if you ever paid attention. It's coming up in a few weeks, so when you get to Shul, not Shabbat, you can say, oh, now I understand what this means. In the beginning of the last chapter of Vayikra, in verse 9, it tells you, if you have a behemah, asher yakrivu mimenu korban laHashem, kol asher yiteh mimenu laHashem yeh kodesh, okay, so you bring an animal to be sacrificed, Lo yachlifenu, lo yamiroto, to bera, rabatov. This is tmura. You can never transfer it because once it's sanctified, this is kedushat aguf. That's basically what they're talking about. The next pasuk says, "Ve'im kol behemat me'ah asher lo yakrivu mimenu korban laHashem." But if you were to sanctify an animal that's tameh, which in this context usually means not kosher. Okay, you take an animal that can't come on the altar because it's a non-kosher animal. Basically, do pidyon, okay? Assess its value and redeem it. Simple reading of that pasuk is it's talking about a non-kosher animal. It says be'emat me'ah, non-kosher animal. The problem is that later in the chapter, in verse 27, okay, again, we're in verse 27 of, I'm going to show you this whole thing outside because without reading the psukim inside, you can't really understand it. So first we're going to tell you the whole psukim, and then we're going to read it inside. Okay? Then it says in verse 26, if you have a bechor, okay, lo yagidisho to ishoto im shorim sela Hashemu, okay, it goes to God no matter right already. You can't sanctify because it's already sanctified. And then it says, ve'im bebehemat me'ah, if it's a non-kosher animal, upada be'erkecha, you redeem it and then you add a fifth, etc. Now, it sounds like the simple reading is the first pasuk is referring to non-kosher animals. The second pasuk is also referring to non-kosher animals, but in the context of bechor. If it's a bechor, then, right, and it's not kosher, well, then it's not a bechor. Now, we know that, okay? First of all, it says, Peter chamor yifdeh b'seh. Now, chamor is not kosher animal. There's different rules for that. No one ever thought it would be sacrificed. So that pasuk, they basically assume, cannot be referring to the laws of bechor. It must be telling you that that exactly what we thought the first pasuk was talking about. It must be telling you that if you have a non-kosher animal that you sacrifice to give, if you sanctify a non-kosher animal, you redeem it. Okay? Which means that the earlier pasuk can't be talking about the same thing. Okay, so what they basically say is we have two psukim basically saying, if you have a non-kosher animal, you redeem it. So what are they going to say? The first one must not be referring to a non-kosher animal. It must be referring to, our case, a Baal Mum. Okay, Be'emat Me'ah means a blemished animal. And that's where we see what the Gemara made reference to yesterday, that a Baal Mum is called a Be'emat Me'ah. Okay, that's outside. Now we're going to read the exact same thing inside. U'Baal Mum hechi ikre tameh. So where's a Baal Mum called tameh? With the first line of our daf. Ditanya, as it says in a braita. First they're going to quote the earlier pasuk. Ve'im kol be'emat me'ah asher lo yakrivu mimenu korban la'Hashem. If you have a be'emat me'ah, impure animal, which impure could mean, we're going to see what it means. Asher lo yakrivu mimenu korban la'Hashem, that can't be brought as a sacrifice. So that verse is referring to blemished animals that can't be sacrificed because they're blemished, not because they're not kosher. So you have the Gemara, the braita asks in a classic Midrash Halacha style, you're saying it's referring to blemished animals that are redeemed. Maybe it's actually talking about non-kosher animals. Well, because later in the chapter it talks about non-kosher animals. Well, that for sure is referring to non-kosher animals. So what am I going to do with the earlier pasuk? Okay, and then they say that earlier pasuk must be referring to Baalei Mumim, and that's where we got into that thing. Oh, if Baal Mum is called Tameh, then maybe a Tameh is like a Baal Mum. Okay? Now, so again, that was verse 27, okay, in Vayikra. So that second pasuk is referring to non-kosher, and the first pasuk, 27:11, is referring to the blemished animal. Now we just have one last thing in this braita, which already we got to our point. But yachlu yipadu al mum ovel, that you might think that you could redeem even for a mum that's going to pass. Let's say the animal will heal. Maybe you can redeem an animal like that. Talmud Lomal, again, they're going to darshan that pasuk, verse 11, Asher lo yakrivu mimenu korban laHashem, which cannot be sacrificed to God. Why to add those words? Notice those words weren't in the later pasuk, because they want to tell you, Mi she'ena kreva l'shem kol ikar. It's an animal that can never be sacrificed to God. But if it can be sacrificed tomorrow, then it can be redeemed. This, by the way, okay, they really didn't need to bring this, although I think one possible reason why they brought it, or at least something we can gain from it, I don't know if that was their purpose, but this is kind of building the idea that we're going to talk about today a lot, which is under what circumstances can redeem things, okay? We don't want to redeem things if they can be used on the altar, really. So if this animal maybe can't, right, once something has sanctity, we prefer not to redeem it. So we're going to redeem it if it has absolutely no use and won't have any use in the future at all. But if it could be fixed and eventually come back, then we're not going to allow redemption because it's already got sanctification. Okay, that's a concept to keep in your head. Now what we're going to have in the next section, just to clarify everything, make it as clear and as organized as possible today, because it is a complicated daf. We're now going to have two difficulties on Shmuel, and they're both going to be resolved in the same type of manner. Okay, the same type of answer. So again, Shmuel said, if something is kedushat dami, which means just its value is non-inherent sanctity like an animal that's going on the altar, but if it's kedushat dami, it can be redeemed, whether it's tameh, which is what the Mishna talked about, if it becomes impure. It can even be redeemed if it's tahor. Okay? Because not inherent sanctity, just its value can always be redeemed. Okay? Now that goes a little bit against, and that's why I'm going to say there's these things pulling, that once something's sanctified, we'd rather not get rid of sanctity. So the theory against Shmuel is to say only if it's impure, only if it gets ruined and it can't be used in the temple, then we can redeem it. But if it's still perfect, maybe it can't be redeemed. Okay? So Shmuel thinks it can be redeemed no matter what, as long as we don't get into the kedushat aguf category, where it has inherent sanctity, we can always redeem it, no matter what. So motive Rav Huna bar Manoach. First difficulty is from Rav Huna bar Manoach, and he says, I'm going to raise difficulty on you from the Mishna. Ha'ofot v'haitzim v'halavona u'klei sharet shenitmeu ein lahem pidyon. Shelo ne'emar pidyon ela bebehema. So this we saw in our Mishnah. Birds that you sanctify, wood, frankincense, and sacred vessels that became impure cannot be redeemed. Why? We kind of said because they have inherent sanctity. But now we're going to see, okay, it's a little bit tricky here. Now, if they're nitmeu, if they become impure, they don't have pidyon. Why? Because pidyon was only for a behemah. Okay, now we want to understand this. Why, really? So, ofot are the easiest ones to understand. Okay, bishlama ofot, kedushat haguf ninu. Okay, ofot have inherent sanctity because they're just like animals. If you say, I'm bringing this bird to the temple, obviously you mean for a sacrifice, okay, unless you said otherwise, and then we're going to talk about that case later. But the assumption is a bird and animal, they're already immediately designated kedushat haguf. And then, right, they're kedushat haguf ninu, and lo ne'emar ela bebehema. The whole exemption of a Baal Mum is only for an animal, it's not for a tamei bird. Ela eitzimu levonau klei sharet liparku. But why can't you redeem wood and frankincense and klei sharet? So now we have to explain what. If I just say I'm bringing wood, who's to say the wood is for the altar and it's kadosh kedushat haguf, inherent sanctity? So why shouldn't these be allowed to be redeemed? So what they're going to say right now is lav mishum de tahorim ba'al ma'ein niftim must be because things that are sanctified for the temple and like kedushat damim and they're tahor, they're not redeemed. Okay, now how does this connect? We're going to see. It's a bit of a complicated argument, but he's going to say the following. Hane, these, even though these are nitmu, they're really like torim. So let's start in the opposite order. Okay, we'll say it like this. I think it'll be more clear. These things are nitmu and can't be redeemed. Okay, why not? Because they're not really nitmu. Okay, because, why are we going to say that? We're going to say it like this. They're not really nitmu. They're really torim, which we're going to have to explain why. And if they're torim, why can't they be redeemed? Must be because things that are tahor can't be redeemed. Okay? What we're going to basically say is, these are different than the birds, even though they're listed all as one. Birds, because they have inherent sanctity. These don't necessarily have inherent sanctity. They're not like animals and things like that. They get offered as sacrifices on the altar. Now, you can bring them on the altar, but we're going to see it's a bit different. They're going to say these are things that are basically things that are tehorim, that have value. Their value is sanctified. And torim can't be redeemed. And that's going to be the proof against Shmuel. Because the only way to explain it is that they're like torim. And, okay, now why should something tamei be like tahor? We're going to see. But just get it in your head first. They're like torim, and that's why. Okay, in other words, basically he says, I can't come up with any other reason why they wouldn't be redeemed. So therefore it must be they're only kedushat damim. And they're, even though they're impure, they're actually like pure. And kedushat damim, things that are pure, can't be redeemed because who's to say that, right? That we'd rather not take away sanctity if we can avoid it, and we only do it when they're nitmu. Now, in order for something to become tamei, it has to either be a vessel or it has to be a food. Right? Those are things, vessels or food become impure. Now, wood and frankincense are not a vessel and they're not food. So now we're going to understand why they're actually, even though they're nitmu, they're like tohorim, because there really is no tumah for these things. Okay, that's the idea here. I'm reading this part that, for me, it actually appears in parentheses. And it's actually a little confusing, and I could see why some people took it out, but we're going to read it anyway. They're not food. Nobody eats wood or frankincense. Ella, so then why is there, obviously there's concept of tumah by them, because it says nitmu. What we're going to basically say is, even though they're nitmu and there is some sort of tumah, but they're really going to be viewed like torim. Why is that? Now, why do they have tumah by them? Because they're so special in the temple. They have this special, because we use wood to burn the fire. That's important. It has, I would say, even not like chiba is love of the kodesh. But what it really means is they have a unique role in the temple. And because of that, they're considered like food that can become impure. Okay, but it's not really. Okay, it's this way that they're kind of like food. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's what makes them susceptible to impurity? Chibat HaKodesh. Now, when is there Chibat HaKodesh? When they're Ra'oi LeKodesh, when they can be used on the altar. Now, Eitzim, Kamad Lo Mishapilu L'Gzirin Lo Mitkashrei. Unless they're cut in a very particular manner, they're not actually Ra'oi to be used on the Mizbeach. And Levon Nami, Kamad Lo Kitcha B'Kli Sharet Lo Mitkashra. And frankincense, until you actually put it in a vessel, a sanctified vessel or a sacred vessel, it can't go on the altar either. So, what are we going to say? Before we get to the klei sharet, we'll talk about that in a minute. That's a little bit different. So these two items, basically, if I just say wood or frankincense to the temple, they're not ready right now to go on the altar, so the chibat HaKodesh doesn't really kick in. So even though they're nitmu, they're actually not really nitmu. They're really more like tehorim because, in other words, these items can't be redeemed because they're like things that have their value is sanctified, but they're still pure. Okay? Because they're like, okay, now they are nitmu, but it's like they're not nitmu. And that's why if they were really nitmu, then theoretically we'd be allowed to redeem them because they're nitmu. But because their only reason to have potential to even be called nitmu is only when they're really ready for going on the altar because of the chibat HaKodesh. So we're going to view them as if they're like Tohorim. And what do you see here? The reason why they can't be redeemed must be because Tohorim are not niftim. That's basically the idea. And Kli Sharet, it's a different issue. Ho'il v'ilei tarab mikvah. This goes back to the same thing about the Baal Mum Over, the Mum Over. If the Mum's going to pass, then we don't let you redeem it because it'll eventually be able to be used. A Kli Sharet can't be redeemed because all you have to do is put in a mikvah and it'll be fine again. So we'd rather just fix the problem than redeem it, than allow it to be redeemed. That's Rav Huna bar Manoach's theory. He's just trying to figure out really the Eitzim and the Levonah, the more complicated ones, and he says it must be that, again, just going to summarize it one last time, it must be that these are items that can't be redeemed because even though they're nitmu, they're like nitharu, they're like their tohorim because only chibat HaKodesh makes them like food, but really they're not theoretically susceptible to impurity because they're not a vessel and they're not food, and therefore they're really treated like tohorim, and that shows you the fact that they can't be redeemed because they're like tohorim shows you that tohorim can't be redeemed. Okay, that's his theory. We're going to reject this right now, and we're going to say no, that's not true. Lo lam emalachan. This is to resolve the difficulty against Shmuel anyway. Maybe he's right, but for Shmuel, we're going to have to explain it otherwise. Shmuel thinks tohorim are niftim, you can redeem them. Lo lam emalachat tohorim ba'alma niftim. Really, regular tohorim can be. Now, why? Now, we're going to say this is, I would call this like a business model of the rabbis. Okay? The rabbis specifically said these items can't be redeemed, even though normally things that are tahor can be redeemed. These can't be redeemed if they're tahor and also if they're tameh. Okay? But, right, hane, and that's again, because when they're tameh, they're really like they're tahor. Hane mishum de lo shchichehu. These are very uncommon. It's very hard to find wood. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a minute. What do you mean? And frankincense and even sacred vessels. They're very rare. And therefore, because they're rare, the rabbis didn't allow them to be redeemed. If I dedicate something to the temple that's rare, okay, this is why I call it a business model. The rabbis were smart and they said, we're not going to let you redeem that. We need more wood in the temple. We need more frankincense in the temple. We don't want someone to then undo what they did. Now, technically, you can undo it and redeem it. But the rabbis said, hey, we want to make sure we have enough of that stuff in the temple. So if somebody offers that, we're not going to let them redeem it. And that's why they can't be redeemed. It has nothing to do with are the tohorim redeemed or not. Nothing to do with that at all. The rabbis just don't want Eitzim and Levonah to be redeemed. Okay? Now, the Gemara says, Bishlama levona uklei sharet lo shchiche. Okay, again, frankincense is basically hard to find. Klei sharet, sacred vessels, hard to find. Ela itzim mishka shchiche. But come on, wood you can find anywhere. I mean, I know nowadays people are worried, we're going to run out of wood in the world, but basically wood is a resource that's pretty easy to find. So they say, now itzim nami kevanda amar kol etch nimtzabo tola pasul l'gabei mizbeach hilkach lo shchiche. There might be a lot of wood, but most of the wood is worm infested. And since a worm infested piece of wood can't be used on the altar, so wood that can go on the altar is actually rare. So we've resolved that. Okay, so that was our basic difficulty where he was trying to explain the Mishnah, and in the end he said, the Mishnah, we thought leads us to say, even though it really didn't say it, but leads us to say the reason why these things can't be redeemed is because they're really like their tahor, because really they're not really matame tumat ochlin, can't really become tameh, only because of chibat hakodesh, and therefore they're going to say they're like torim, and torim can't be redeemed, and that's the reason. In the end, they reject that, and they say the reason you can't redeem them is because they're rare, and the rabbis didn't allow pidyon for rare items. That's going to be the same answer we're going to give to the second case. First, let's see the second difficulty. Amar Rav Papa. Shmuel haditanya. If Shmuel had heard this braita, and we're going to now read the braita, I'm just going to read you the words that come after the braita, because it's like mid-sentence, hava hadrabe. He would have changed his mind. Okay, Rav Papa's convinced, after he sees this braita, Shmuel must not have seen this braita, and if Shmuel had seen this braita, there's no way he would have said what he did. That tohurim niftim. Okay, what's the braita? Hamatpis tmimim lebedek habayit. This is, I said, we get to this case. Somebody says, I'm giving animals that are unblemished, perfect animals. I'm dedicating them to the bedek habayit. Bedek habayit means to the upkeep of the temple. Not, right, that's kedushat damim, right, where I'm giving, animals aren't used for upkeep of the temple. It would mean that they're meant to be redeemed and, right, just their value is sanctified. Well, the ruling is, ein podim otam ela lemizbeach. Now, you can redeem them, but you can't redeem them in a normal manner. Normally, what would you do? Right? I always give the example of the couch. I said, bring my couch to the temple. Obviously, I'm not going to schlep my couch to the temple. What do? I sell my couch. I take the money. I give it to the temple. I can't do that with this animal. I can't just sell the animal, give the money to the temple. So this basically means there's no normal pidyon here. There is pidyon, but it's a weird kind of way, which is basically saying you can't just redeem it. What do? I sell it to you. You're going to the temple to bring a sacrifice. Because once this animal is designated for the Beit HaMikdash, since it could go on the altar, it has to go on the altar. Now, I said it goes to maintenance, so we have to give it to the temple maintenance. So what do? I sell it to someone who's going to the temple to bring a korban. So in the end, the animal goes to the altar. Okay, that's definite. Animal's going to go to the altar, but my money is going to go to the temple maintenance, okay? But I sell it to someone who's going to put it on the altar. That's what it means, ein podinotan ela lemizbeach. Shekol hara oil lemizbeach, because anything you sanctify that could go on the altar, eino yotzei mizbeach midei mizbeach leolam. It can never leave mizbeach. It's going to go on the mizbeach. And again, I have something in parentheses. This seemed like it's just a note that someone added later to kind of explain it a little more. So let's just read it because it explains it. Okay, that's the main point here. Even though it's kedushat damim, and only its value is sanctified because it's for the temple maintenance, it's not nifted because they're torim. Tmimim and torim is the same thing, right? They're perfect. They were oil for the altar. So if he had heard this, he would have changed his mind and said, look, nifti, torim, for kedushat damim, torim are not niftim. That's what you see here. Velohi, shmi'alei velo hadrabe. Okay, now they say it's not true because Shmuel actually heard this braita and he still held by his position. Why is that? Hachanami, same thing we answered before. Also here, kevan deshchiche mumin de pasle bebehema dafilu bedugan shabayinami pasle. Since blemishes, which disqualify animals, are super common, especially because dugan shabayin is a mum. Okay, remember that's like perhaps some problem with the cornea, some sort of problem in the eye. So I say some sort of because there's all different opinions among the commentaries what this is. But anyway, a very common eye ailment. So hilkach lo shchiche. So again, the same idea. Because it's uncommon to find perfectly unblemished animals, that's why the rabbis didn't allow pidyon. But in regular things that are not so rare, the rabbis will allow pidyon. Okay? That's the idea. That's Shmuel. Two difficulties again. Shmuel, we resolve them. Now we're going to explain the other, or we're going to see. We're not going to really explain it, but we're going to see there's another position. Okay? And it's brought by several rabbis. Rav Kahana Amar, Tme'im Niftim, Tolim Ein Niftim. Okay? Again, Shmuel completely. Only if they're impure can they be redeemed, even if they don't have inherent sanctity, even if it's just kedushat damim. Okay? Their value is sanctified. That's enough. Tolim Ein Niftim. If they're pure, they don't get redeemed. V'chein amar Rabbi Oshaya. Rabbi Oshaya also said that. Me'im niftim torim ein niftim. But ika da'amre, some people say, amar Rav Oshaya afilu torim niftim. We have a big debate about what Rabbi Oshaya said. The whole next sugya is going to be premised on that. Whether he said like Shmuel or against Shmuel, we don't know. Okay, put that aside for one more minute. Rabbi Elazar omer kulam tme'im niftim torim ein niftim. Rabbi Elazar says the same thing. Torim are not niftim. Against Shmuel, he's with Rav Kahana and one reading of Rabbi Oshaya. But he adds one exception. Okay, the mincha chote, if you remember, is the sliding scale offering. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm going to try to do this really quickly because it's not germane to our topic. But there's two psukim there. If you remember, there's if you're rich, if you're middle level, and if you're poor. So it's animal, bird, mincha. There's two psukim. One appears earlier in the section about mechatato, from his chatat. And from there, they always say from means not all of it, though. So now they say this comes to teach you if someone was wealthy and then separated money and then couldn't afford it anymore, right? They dropped in their wealth before they bought the animal. They're allowed to only take some of what they designated, and the rest just becomes chulin. You don't even have to redeem the money. Okay, it automatically loses its sanctity in this case. Very interesting halacha. Al chatato appears specifically in the very poor. And al is the reverse of me. Me means some and not all. Al means more than. So this is the important one for our purposes. What this means is, if you're poor, really poor, and you separate money for a mincha, and then you become wealthy, what do? You redeem that. Like you bought solet already, you resell the solet, you redeem it, and buy with it an animal offering. So what do you see there? That can be redeemed, even if it's tahor, but nothing else. Okay? That's what he says. If anything else is tahor, that's the only exception to the rule. Okay. That's his proof, because he says, if the Torah has to tell you specifically there, then it must be. You can't do it otherwise. Now we're going to we want to go back to the fact that Rabbi Oshaya said two different things, but it's going to take us a long time to get back there. We're going to start with some other statement of Rabbi Oshaya, and then we're going to get into a whole sugya about this, ultimately come back to, wait, but this answer to this contradiction basically only fits with one opinion of Rabbi Oshaya. Okay? Torim niftim or Torim ein niftim, we're going to see. Okay? That's where we're going here. But we're going to leave this topic for a minute and delve into this. Amar Rabbi Oshaya, Shamati pigel b'mincha Rabbi Shimon eno matame tumat ochlin. Okay, we're not so far off. We're talking about what's tumat ochlin. Now, tumat ochlin, before we've been talking about, right? It's like wood. Well, you can't eat it, but yet because of klipat hakodesh, it becomes matame tumat ochlin. Now we're talking about food. A mincha offering. It's food. But if it's forbidden to benefit from, okay, which pigul is forbidden to benefit from. So if you messed up your mincha and you made a pigul, which you can't eat it and you can't sell it and you can't give it to someone, you can't do anything with it. You can't give it to a Gentile, nothing. No benefit. So because of that, Rabbi Shimon is going to hold, and we're going to see why Rabbi Shimon specifically, but Rabbi Shimon is going to say it's not metame tumat ochlin. This is something to remember when we come back here. The mincha shepigel, because it's forbidden to benefit from, there's no tumat ochlin. So if somebody touches it when they're impure, it's not going to be susceptible to impurity. But why? Now, this is a fascinating concept. Before, we want to take something that wasn't food and say, well, we can make it like food because of chibat hakodesh. Now we're going to take something that is food and say, because halachically it's not food, right? It's like doing the same thing but the reverse. Because halachically it's not food because you can't eat it and you can't give it to anyone else to eat, so it's not food and it's not susceptible to impurity. That's basically what we're saying. And that's Rabbi Shimon's position. That's what he says. Now, how do we know this would be according to Rabbi Shimon? Okay, ditnan, I think it should be ditanya. It's a braita, yeah. Ditanya. It's actually a tosefta. Ha'orla v'kilei kerem v'shor niskal turning out amud bet. Okay, we're going to list all these things. I'm not going to go in detail into what all these things are, even though I like to often review these things, but we don't have time today. But you can look them up again if you don't remember them all. But we've had them before. Orla, which is from a tree. Kilei kerem, things from the ground. Short. Now, these are all foods that are forbidden to benefit from. Shor haniskal, egla rufatzi, porei mitzorah, peter chamor, basar b'chalav, kulam mitamim tumat ochlin. Now, according to the rabbis, these are all foods. Who cares that you can't eat them and you can't benefit from them? They're all food. They are susceptible to impurity because they are food. Halachic categorization, whether you can eat them or not or give them to someone else, is irrelevant. Rabbi Shimon Omer, and this is Rabbi Shimon's position that Rabbi Oshaya was referring to, kulan e mitamim tumat ochlin. Okay? None of these are matame tumat ochlin. He's going to have one exception to the rule. But if we go back to Rabbi Oshaya wants to say, well, I would put another one on the list, the pigul b'mincha. Okay? Umode Rabbi Shimon, but the braita continues and says, he agrees, though, b'basar b'chalav, with the rabbis. Shemitame tumat ochlin. Why is basar b'chalav different? Main difference between basar b'chalav and all these other things, ho'il v'aytalo shata kosher, because the basar b'chalav could have been eaten before. Before you mix the milk and meat and cook them together, you could have eaten the milk, could have eaten the meat. Okay? So because it was food at some point, before it became forbidden, it's fine. And what do you mean? What about shor niskal, egla, rufa, tziburim, etc.? They were also food before, but they weren't because they were still alive. A live animal is not food, right? You don't look at an animal and say food, right? You look at a piece of meat in the butcher shop. That's food, okay? So those weren't food before they became forbidden. They became forbidden before they were food. The basar b'chalav is the opposite. What about kilei kerem and orla, fruits growing on a tree? But again, they were attached to the ground. That's not food. Until they're detached from the ground, they're not considered food. Remember also, for purposes of impurity, you have to detach them from the ground. They have to be water has to come upon them, and then, right, then they'll be susceptible to impurity because they're not ready to be eaten yet. Okay? So anyway, basar b'chalav is an exception, but this is an important exception. This is going to be important for later because it was potentially able to be eaten, and therefore, even though now it's forbidden to benefit, but it was able to be eaten. Okay, we'll come back to that idea. Right now, we're going to keep going. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, my time at Rabbi Shimon. So first, we want to know what's his opinion. Where does he get it from? Well, the pasuk that talks about impurity of food, about water getting on it and all that, about things becoming susceptible to impurity, uses the term mikol ha'ochel asher ye'achel, from all the food that will be eaten. It doesn't say asher yochal, that you will eat. Food that will be eaten, that means ochel shata yechol achilo la'achirim. It's not just that you can eat, but you can feed someone else. Karoi ochel, that's food. But if you can't feed it to others because it's forbidden to benefit from, eino karoi ochel. Okay, it's not food. Now, they say, V'ha, and here comes again what Rabbi Oshaya said. So now we had the braita, and now we're going to just repeat what Rabbi Oshaya said about this. V'ha pigel b'mincha nami ochel she'iyat hayachol achilo lachirimu. You can't just take the pigul, the mincha that was piguled, and say, remember that's if while they were doing the kmitza, the Kohen said, I'm going to eat this beyond designated time. It becomes pigul. If you eat it, it's karet. If anyone eats it, it's karet. So you can't give it to anybody else. It's completely forbidden to benefit from. Perfect. Okay. But now they say, okay, first they have a side question before we get to our main question. It's just a side question on, wait a minute. Ihachi, basar b'chalav nami tepukle de'ochel shatay yechol achilo la'acherimu. Basar b'chalav is not forbidden to benefit from. Well, it is actually, but Rabbi Shimon holds it's not. So the same Rabbi Shimon, we're now going to have a problem. We should say that the reason why Rabbi Shimon doesn't agree, agrees with the rabbis about basar b'chalav and it's not on his list, not because it was potentially able to be eaten before, but because he doesn't even think it's forbidden to benefit from, as we're going to see right now. So they're just questioning the language of the braita. Why the braita say the reason is because lo hayta lashat kosher. The reason should be because it's not forbidden to benefit, according to Rabbi Shimon. Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda Omio mishum Rabbi Shimon basar b'chalav asur b'chila umutar b'hana. He has this dissenting opinion also about this. He says it's actually forbidden to benefit from. And where does he prove it from? We're going to see right now. Shenemar ki am kadosh atah Hashem Elokecha lo tvashel di b'chalev imo. So one of the psukim that talks about don't eat milk and meat starts off with am kadosh atah. You're a sanctified nation. Ula halanu omer. There's a different pasuk which says anshe kodesh tiyunli. The same language. Be sanctified people to me. Ubasar b'stet trefa lo tuchelu. Don't eat basar b'stet trefa. Okay, and then it says la kelev tashlichunot. Okay, these are the laws of nevela. That if there's a dead animal, you can give it to your dog, meaning you can benefit. So he says, Mala halana sor b'chila mutar b'na'af, kana sor b'chila mutar b'na. Nevela can't be eaten but can benefit. Also, basar b'chalav, you can't eat but you can benefit. Okay, so shouldn't that be his reason? It's just not in this list because, right, it's not in his list of things that are forbidden to benefit from that don't have isur achila because it's not forbidden to benefit. To which they answer, okay, don't worry about that question. Chad ve'od kamer. He has two reasons why it wouldn't be on the list. Either one would have been enough to get it off the list. Chad ve'od kamer, so there's one and another. Chad de'ochel shatay yechol achila l'acheri. Okay, one is because you can feed it to others. And meaning it's not forbidden to benefit. Ve'od l'didi nami hayta lo shata kosher. And also because it had shata kosher. Okay, so the first part we did is we brought this Rabbi Oshaya, who says that Rabbi Shimon, who appears in this Tosefta with all this list of things that are forbidden to benefit and therefore are not susceptible to impurity, he would add pigul b'mincha to the list. Meitive. Here comes our difficulty. Okay, we're still not back to our original topic. We'll get there soon. Rabbi Shimon Omer, yesh notar shu matami tumat ochlin, v'yesh notar she'eno matami tumat ochlin. Okay, again, this idea of Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says, he's going to talk about three things. The third one is the one that interests us. But right now, we're going to read the others anyway. There's a case of notar, if you leave the meat beyond its designated time, where it's considered food. And there's a case where notar is not really considered food and won't be matame tumat ochlin. What's the difference? Ketzad. Lan lifnei zrika, if you didn't sprinkle the blood, then what happened? It never became food. Because an animal, right, first it's alive, it's not food. You slaughter it, it's not food because you have to sprinkle the blood. Only once you sprinkle the blood is the meat going to be permitted to eat. So if you never permitted the meat to eat, then it was never food, and therefore it's not matame tumat ochlin. Okay, so if you stop in the middle, slaughter the animal, but never sprinkle the blood and left it till the next day, it's called notar, but it's not the classic notar. Notar is usually if I already did the blood and I just didn't eat all the meat. But here we're saying it's also notar, but it's not matame tumat ochlin because it was never food. But lan la'achar zrika matame tumat ochlin. But if I basically sprinkled the blood on the right day and I just didn't eat the meat and I left it till the next morning, then it would be ruined. Again, next morning, depending on which sacrifice, but next night for some, that's irrelevant. Upigul be'bekachim kalim eino matame tumat ochlin. But pigul, this is a different issue. Pigul, whether it's high level or low level sanctity korban, it doesn't matter. It's never matame tumat ochlin because it's completely forbidden to benefit from. Pigel b'mincha, if I did it in a mincha, here's our key thing. You ready? Pigel b'mincha, this is Rabbi Shimon. What are you expecting him to say? There's no tumat ochlin because it's forbidden to benefit. Mitame tumat ochlin. Wait a minute. Rabbi Oshaya said that Rabbi Shimon would add pigul b'mincha to his list of not mitame tumat ochlin because it's forbidden to benefit from. But here it says the exact opposite. So how are we going to resolve that? Very simply, lo kasha, kan shaitala shata kosher, kan shelo aitala shata kosher. Well, what do we keep saying? If it was food like basar b'chalav, and at some point you could have eaten it, so we'll say pigul b'mincha, if you could have eaten it beforehand, is ochel. And matame tumat ochlin. If you couldn't have eaten it before, and then it's not matame tumat ochlin. Okay, well, now we have to understand. So what would be a case of now, what is a mincha made of? Solet. Solet could have been eaten before you sanctified it. So what would be a case shelo hayta lashata kosher? Pigul b'mincha is always hayta lashata kosher. So hechidami de lo hayta lashata kosher de akdeshinu b'mechuba. Now we're going to find a case where it could never have been eaten because while the grains were still attached to the ground, before we turned them into solet, before anything, we already sanctified them. I said, I'm going to bring a korban mincha from these grains, and they weren't food yet, right? Because they were attached to the ground. That would be a case. Okay, here comes our big question. That brings us back to the original thing about which opinion Rabbi Oshaya held. V'lifrakinu. Wait a minute. If it's before I've put it into the bowl because it's attached to the ground and I sanctify it, I can always redeem it. No? Can I redeem it? This goes back to the question, can I redeem it if it's tahor or not? So they say, since potential, what do you mean it didn't have a way that I could eat it? If I sanctified these grains in the ground and said, I'm going to bring from these to a mincha, I can redeem them if I want because they're only sanctified kedusha damim, and I can just redeem them whenever I want. So theoretically, they did have a shata kosher because I could have redeemed them whenever I wanted. So, finally we got back here. This makes sense according to the explanation, the ones who say, why is this not shata kosher? Because I couldn't have redeemed it because tohulim are not niftim. I could only redeem it if it gets ruined, but this didn't get ruined, right? Only if it's tameh. But this wasn't tameh, so I can't redeem them ever unless they become tameh, and these are tohurim. So then it makes sense. But lahach lishna da'amar afilu torim niftim. But if Rabbi Oshaya agreed with Shmuel and said torim niftim lifrikinu, I should be allowed to redeem them. Okay, now remember, why are we stuck on Rabbi Oshaya? Because Rabbi Oshaya was the one who said that Shmuel would put pigul on the list, pigul b'mincha on his list. And then we brought this braita that said it's not on the list. And we resolved it by saying we're going to distinguish shata kosher, not shata kosher. But how could you say what is a case of not shata kosher? It was attached to the ground. Why couldn't it be redeemed? Well, if you say Torim could be redeemed, then theoretically it could have been redeemed. So that's called shata kosher, and now we're a little bit stuck according to that explanation. To which they say, simple answer, what does it mean to have shata kosher? The fact that I could potentially redeem it? Hashtami lo parik, but I didn't redeem it. So it really didn't have a shot of kosher. The fact that just because potentially I can redeem it, why should that make a difference? So the Gemara says, of course that makes it. Potential is enough. Let's see. V'kevan di'ibai parikla, shamina le Rabbi Shimon da'amar kol omei lipadok ki padoi dami. He says, wait a minute, but Rabbi Shimon actually holds that if something has the potential to be redeemed, we view it as if it's redeemed. How do we know that? We're going to see that right now. And therefore, it does make a difference of its potential. So now we're back to square one. If we say that potentially, the fact that potentially it could have been redeemed, it's as if it's redeemed, then it should have shata kosher. And then we don't have any case to basically say, oh yeah, that was talking about when it didn't have a shata kosher, because it always could be potentially redeemed. Okay, so now, and if it could be potentially redeemed, it's as if it was redeemed. Where does he say this? Well, he says it by para aduma, Titania. Rabbi Shimon Omer, this is a surprising halacha, by the way. If you have a para aduma and you're slaughtering it, ready for make the red heifer waters, and you find a nicer one, you switch it, okay? You basically redeem the first one, and you take the new one, okay? So that's the background for this. Rabbi Shimon says, para aduma we're talking about, mitam'at tumat ochlin. Okay, now para is never really to be eaten, right? Because it's a red heifer, which we're going to now slaughter, then burn the ashes, make the para aduma, never becomes food. But it is matami tumat ochlin. Why? Ho'il v'aytala shata kosher, because it could have been eaten at some point. When could it have been eaten? Well, Amar Rish Lakish, Omer Haya Rabbi Shimon, he comes and explains this. So Rabbi Shimon says, para nifdei al gav marachta. Even after you slaughter it, you can redeem it. So because you can redeem it, even you're already in the middle of the process, if you find a better animal, you can redeem it. So therefore, now, what do we see here? The para, which became tumat ochlin, I didn't redeem it, but it can be tumat ochlin. Why? Because it could have potentially been redeemed. So here, what do you see? The fact that it could have potentially been redeemed, we view it as if it was redeemed, and we view it as food, even though it really never was. So there you see the potential is enough. So now they say, right, so, hachi hashta, no, you're comparing para aduma to mincha, okay? Why? Why is that a weird comparison or a bad comparison? Bishlama para omedet liftoti, she'im matzah acheret na'em and a mitzvah liftota. Okay, and this is, I saw you ask in the chat, you can redeem it, first of all, only if you find a better animal. But not only that, you have a mitzvah to redeem it if you find a better animal. You're supposed to, okay? This, by the way, para aduma is beta kabayit. It's not a sacrifice. That's right, because sacrifices, you can never do this. That would be tmura to replace it. But this is not a sacrifice. So now we're going to say, okay, para aduma, there's a mitzvah to redeem. Because there's a mitzvah to redeem, Shmuel's going to say, even if you didn't redeem it, it's as if it was redeemed because it had this mitzvah upon it to be redeemed. But hani menachot mitzvah liftotam, but there's no mitzvah ever to redeem a mincha. So we're not going to view minchas as if they were redeemed just because they could have been. The potential to redeem something when there's no mitzvah to do it is not considered as if it was redeemed. And that basically answers our question. Lo etala shata kosher, it was attached to the ground. And we don't say, well, just because it could have been redeemed, we view it as if it was redeemed. No, it really is not viewed as it was redeemed, and it never could have been eaten, and that would be the case to resolve that contradiction between the two. What we thought Shmuel would have said and what Shmuel actually said, we're going to say, right, what we thought Shmuel said is true, it's just each one is talking about a different case. Okay, and we've resolved that. But now we're going to still ask questions on this, because you're going to say now that this theory that if it's potential, it's as if it was done is only for para aduma when there's a mitzvah, and it's not when there's not a mitzvah. Well, we're going to have a problem now from the case of notar that we talked about before. V'halan lifnei zrika. If we said before, if it's lan, if you leave it before zrika, you never did the zrika, we said it doesn't have a shata kosher, right? Now, because you never could have eaten the animal. But wait, it was a mitzvah lemizrake, v'bai zarak. It was a mitzvah to sprinkle the blood, and if you had sprinkled it, right, you would have permitted the meat. So according to your theory, what would we say about lan lifnei zrika? Since it potentially could have been meat, it should be matami tumat ochlin. But that's not what we said. We said katani ain matami tumat ochlin. So how are we going to resolve this? Well, when the braita said lan lifnei zrika eino matami tumat ochlin, it was talking about that you didn't have enough time to sprinkle the blood. And that's why we don't view this, oh, well, potentially it should have been as if, because there was no potential to sprinkle the blood. So now they say, wait a minute. According to this, you're basically saying like this. So you're saying lan lifnei zrika, and there was enough time to do the zrika during the day, then it would be matame tumat ochlin? Well, then that's absurd what the braita said, because aditane lan la'achar zrika matame tumat ochlin. It said, if it's left overnight before you did zrika, then it's, after you did zrika, then it would be matame tumat ochlin. Well, liflag bedida. Why didn't it just say that case inside? If you're saying lan before zrika, if you left it and you never sprinkled the blood, it depends what time of day. Don't you think the Mishna should have said that? Instead, the Mishna says, if you did it after zrika, where it was already meat, then it'd be matame tumat ochlin. But why didn't you just say lan if you did? Here, we're going to read it now. When we say it's not matame tumat ochlin, shelo hayta lo shiur b'yom, right? Only in this very unique case where you slaughtered it right at the very, very end of the day, and you couldn't sprinkle the blood because there was no time. Aval, it should have said though, aval hayta lo shiur b'yom matame tumat ochlin. Should have said that. To which the Gemara says that's really what they are saying in the Mishna and the braita. And just read it like this. Hachinami kamar. Really is what it said. Lan kodem sheyera el zrika eno matame tumat ochlin. If you did lan, if you left it over before it even had potential for sprinkling, meaning you saw the animal right at the very, very end of the day, then it's eino matame tumat ochlin. La'achar sheyera el zrika, after it had potential to become the blood was sprinkled, not that the blood actually had to be sprinkled, mitame tumat ochlin, then it would be. Okay, and they basically, in order, okay, what was this? This was to resolve, we had a difficulty, contradiction, Rabbi Oshaya against himself about what Rabbi Shimon said and what he claimed Rabbi Shimon said. We resolved it by saying shada kosher, not shada kosher. Then we said, what's a lo shad kosher when it comes to the mincha? And then we said it must be it was attached to the ground. Why can't you redeem it? Well, that works with torim ein niftim, but it doesn't work with torim niftim. If Rabbi Oshaya really said torim are niftim, because the potential is as if it was done. And then we said, no, that's only paraduma where there's a mitzvah, and not here where there's no mitzvah. And then we resolved it. But distinguishing mitzvah and not mitzvah, the mitzvah is as if it's done, seems to create a problem for the lan case. And why didn't the Mishna say that then? But we resolved that basically. This is like just an answer to a difficulty on that answer that we brought to at the very last answer we had about distinguishing between the para and the other case. Okay, bit of a complicated sugya. I hope that was organized. We're going to continue with some more questions on this answer we gave about, it was a very fascinating concept, that the potential to do something is as if it's done, but only also if it's a mitzvah, okay? And that makes, there's logic to that. But anyway, then we'll go back to the beginning now. That was a summary of the second part of the daf. The first part of the daf was this Shmuel position. First we saw the Baal Mum, how do we know it's called Tameh? Then we had two difficulties on Shmuel, who said Torim Niftim. Then we tried to show not, but then we said in both those cases it's because it's rare, and the rabbis didn't want to allow pidyon in a rare case. But in other cases that aren't rare, pidyon would be allowed. Okay, and then we just saw there were others who had a different position, and then there was this Rav Ashi who we weren't sure what he said, and then we raised a difficulty on one of those positions based on that whole long thing we got into of the pigel b'mincha and whether or not it's mitame tumat ochlin. Okay, bit of a complicated sugya. A lot of talk of meat apropos Yom Haatzmaut. Wishing everyone a Chag Sameach and a good day and b'sorot tovot in general.